At 67, Ice-T isn't sugarcoating anything. The man who helped invent gangster rap, survived the culture wars, and thrived in Hollywood has seen it all. Now, with decades of experience behind him, he's lifting the lid on hip-hop's darkest secrets. This isn't about petty beefs or childish rivalries. It's about the manipulators, the snakes, and the power players who almost poison the culture from within. These are the 5 people Ice-T calls the most evil in hip-hop. By the late 1980s, hip-hop had grown into a battlefield where respect was everything, and the only weapon that truly mattered was lyrical skill. This was the golden age, a time when MCs went to war on records, not in the streets, and the crown for best rapper alive was up for grabs. On one side stood LL Cool J, a superstar from Queens who had already charmed the mainstream with his charisma and crossover appeal. To fans in New York, he was the golden boy, the face of East Coast rap. On the other side, Ice-T was building his reputation out west, painting raw, unfiltered pictures of Los Angeles street life. For him, rap wasn't just entertainment. It was survival, a reflection of the environment that raised him. The spark that lit the fire was LL Cool J's bold claim that he was the baddest rapper in the history of rap. To most, it was just standard hip-hop bravado, but to Ice-T, it was more than that. Back then, the West Coast was still struggling for recognition, constantly overshadowed by the East Coast media machine. Ice-T felt the weight of an entire coast on his shoulders. As he later explained, "How was I going to be taken seriously if I let someone say they were the best? I had to rap. I had a coast on my back, so I was like, let's go." In other words, it wasn't just about him. It was about showing that the West could stand toe-to-toe with New York's finest. So in 1988, Ice-T took his first swing on his album, Power. The shots weren't blatant at first, but they were sharp. On the interlude for I'm Your Pusher, which cleverly compared hip-hop to a drug trade, Ice-T scripted a moment where a fan happily accepted albums from Eric B., Rakim, and Public Enemy but refused an LL Cool J record. The message was clear. LL might be popular, but his music wasn't what the streets wanted. Then came The Syndicate, where Ice-T tore into LL's obsession with bragging about himself, calling it childish and repetitive. With cutting lines like, "How many times on one album can you say you're deaf? I'm bad. Yo punk, save your breath." Ice-T made it obvious who he was targeting. LL Cool J, however, was never the type to let something like that slide. In 1990, he came back swinging harder than ever on his album Mama Said Knock You Out. On the track To the Break of Dawn, he devoted entire verses to dismantling Ice-T, Kool Moe Dee, and even MC Hammer. He mocked Ice-T's past as a car thief and threw one of his most memorable insults, ridiculing Ice-T's signature curl hairstyle by calling him a hip-hop raccoon. LL's attack didn't stop there. Even years later, in 1995, on the remix to I Shot Ya, he was still throwing punches, bragging about how he had crushed Moe Dee, Hammer, and Ice-T. For LL, this wasn't just about defending his throne, it was about proving he could outlast anyone who challenged him. What made this rivalry fascinating was how long it stretched without the two ever meeting in person. For years, it was strictly a war of words, pure competition fueled by ego and coast-to-coast pride. Unlike the deadly feuds that would later scar hip-hop, this one stayed on wax, showing what rap beef was originally supposed to be. A lyrical sport, a way of testing skills without crossing into real-world violence. Eventually, the feud burned out, not because one man completely destroyed the other, but because the culture itself called for peace. Afrika Bambaataa, one of hip-hop's founding fathers and leader of the Zulu nation, stepped in. Known for promoting unity and respect, he brokered a truce between the two rappers, proving that even at the height of ego-driven battles, there was still a sense of hierarchy and honor within the culture. But the real closure came decades later in an unexpected place, Monte Carlo, at a television convention. By this time, both men had cemented their legacies in very different ways. Ice-T had become a household name not just in music, but on television with his role in Law Order SVU. LL Cool J had evolved into an actor, businessman, and host, still maintaining his place as one of hip-hop's pioneers. When Ice-T finally saw LL in person, he decided to end it once and for all. He extended his hand and said, "Man, me and you have never talked. It wasn't personal, it was only business. You were the guy to come at." LL responded with the perfect words, "Ice, it was a culture." That handshake turned decades of rivalry into mutual respect, even friendship. The two would go on to collaborate on LL's Rock the Bells Radio, a fitting reminder of how battles that once divided the culture could eventually bring it full circle. The next evil on Ice-T's list wasn't a rapper or a rival, it was something far bigger. He pointed straight at the establishment itself, And when Ice-T says the establishment, he's not talking about one single group. He's describing a powerful mix of politicians, police unions, media figures, and corporate executives who all decided he was dangerous and needed to be silenced. As the 1990s began, Ice-T was already known as a pioneer who had given the West Coast its voice in hip-hop, but in 1992, he took a leap that would make him more than a rapper and put him at the center of one of the biggest culture wars in American music history. Alongside his longtime friend, guitarist Ernie C., Ice-T created Body Count, a heavy metal band that pushed boundaries nobody expected. The goal wasn't just to experiment with sound, but to fuse the raw power of rock with the uncompromising honesty of hip-hop, a way of channeling the anger and frustration of Black America into something loud enough that no one could ignore it. Ice-T called it a rock album with a rap mentality, a project meant to be the unfiltered voice of rage, not offering solutions, but screaming the reality that so many live through every day. It was on this stage that the now infamous song Cop Killer appeared. Released on Body Count's debut album, the track was written from the perspective of someone driven to the edge by constant harassment and brutality from the police. At a time when Los Angeles was already a powder keg following the Rodney King beating and the riots that shook the city, the lyrics struck a nerve. Ice-T never pretended the song was literal. He explained again and again that it was a piece of art, a character study, no different from an actor playing a role in a film. He even compared it to David Bowie singing as Ziggy Stardust, saying, "If you believe I'm a cop killer, then you believe David Bowie is an astronaut." To him, it was a protest record, a way to hold up a mirror to America's ugliest reality. But the establishment didn't hear it that way. The backlash was immediate and overwhelming. Suddenly, Ice-T wasn't just an artist, he was painted as a national threat. Police organizations were outraged, politicians lined up to condemn him, and the media whipped up a frenzy. Vice President Dan Quayle called the song obscene, while President George H.W. Bush himself criticized Time Warner for even allowing it to exist. Law enforcement groups mobilized across the country, urging boycotts of all Time Warner products. The pressure became so extreme that police in some cities threatened businesses, telling them they wouldn't respond to emergency calls if those stores kept selling the album. The controversy reached its most theatrical moment in July 1992, when legendary actor Charlton Heston, a shareholder in Time Warner and an outspoken conservative, stood at a shareholders' meeting and read the lyrics to Cop Killer and another Body Count track, KKK Bitch, aloud. It was a performance designed to shame executives and rally outrage. The image of Heston, the star of classic Hollywood epics, quoting Ice-T's lyrics in disgust, became one of the defining snapshots of the battle. At first, Time Warner tried to stand firm. Executives defended the album on First Amendment grounds, with co-CEO Gerald Levin writing that people should pay attention to the pain behind Ice-T's words instead of silencing him. But as the boycotts grew, bomb threats were made against company offices, and investors threatened to pull out, the corporation began to bend. The pressure was too much. Ice-T eventually agreed to remove Cop Killer from future pressings of the album, explaining that he didn't want innocent employees at the label to suffer because of his work. Even so, the damage was done. The following year, after more fights over censorship surrounding his solo record Home Invasion, Ice-T left Warner Brothers completely. What made this moment even more telling was the way the controversy was framed. Body Count was a heavy metal band, a genre where extreme violence, shocking lyrics, and anti-authority themes had been common for years. Bands like Slayer, Metallica, and others had made careers off pushing boundaries in rock and metal, yet they rarely faced the same kind of political firestorm. Instead of treating Body Count as part of that tradition, critics repeatedly labeled Cop Killer a rap song. As Ice-T himself pointed out, it was a deliberate choice meant to stir a racial panic. By branding it as gangster rap, they tapped into America's fear of young black men, making the debate not about freedom of expression or police brutality, but about crime, violence, and the supposed dangers of hip-hop culture. This strategy worked. It blurred genres to paint Ice-T as the face of danger and kept the focus on him rather than the issues his music was highlighting. What happened with Cop Killer became a blueprint for how the establishment could control the conversation. It showed that with enough coordinated pressure, politicians, law enforcement, and corporations could silence voices that challenged them, even when those voices were protected by artistic freedom. And it proved that when race was involved, the stakes rose even higher, with criticism of authority quickly reframed as a threat to society itself. For Ice-T, the entire episode was more than a controversy. It was a turning point that revealed just how far the powerful would go to protect their image and silence dissent. At 67, when he talks about the most evil figures he's ever faced in hip-hop, it isn't just rival MCs or industry politics he remembers. It's moments like this, when the establishment itself united against him, and when art became the spark for a national war over race, authority, and freedom of expression. At number 3, we have Tupac. By the mid-1990s, Ice-T had already lived through more than one battle in hip-hop, but nothing prepared him for what he witnessed with Tupac Shakur. Unlike his back and forth with LL Cool J or the firestorm that came with Body Count's Cop Killer, this wasn't a matter of lyrical sparring or politicians trying to silence him. This was personal, unpredictable, and ultimately deadly. Ice-T had known Tupac from his early days, back when Pac was just a backup dancer for Digital Underground. He remembered him as a kid with a sharp mind, a huge personality, and the kind of raw energy that made you believe he was destined for greatness. Ice-T always described him like a younger brother, someone he wanted to see grow into his potential rather than get swallowed by the darker forces that circled around the industry. Their respect for each other wasn't just talk. They even recorded together on Tupac's 1993 album Strictly 4, My Niggaz, a track called Last Words that also featured Ice Cube. For West Coast hip-hop, that was a powerful statement. Three giants standing together on the same record. But as the years went by and Tupac's life grew more chaotic, the balance in their relationship began to shift. Pac wasn't just the fiery young artist anymore. He was transforming into a man who blurred the lines between his art and his reality. Everything came to a breaking point in 1996. Tupac had just come home from prison, fueled by anger, paranoia, and a need to strike back at those he believed had betrayed him. Signing to death row only poured gasoline on that fire. When he recorded Hit 'Em Up, it wasn't just another diss record, it was an open declaration of war. Unlike the playful jabs Ice-T had once traded with LL Cool J, this track was venomous. Tupac went after Biggie, Bad Boy Records, and even made brutal accusations about Faith Evans, Biggie's wife. The first time Ice-T heard the record was in his own studio, a place he called the Crack House. Tupac came through with his Outlaws crew, full of adrenaline, eager to play this new creation. As soon as the speakers filled the room with the track, Ice-T felt the weight of it. He later admitted that his first reaction wasn't excitement but dread. He pulled Tupac aside and told him straight, "You're gonna start some shit." He knew right away that this wasn't just going to be another hip-hop rivalry that stayed confined to music. The words were too sharp, too personal, and too dangerous. Ice-T pleaded with him, telling him the record crossed lines that should never be crossed. It wasn't about who could rap better anymore. This was about humiliating a man in front of the world and calling for war. To Ice-T, that was a recipe for bloodshed. He told Tupac he didn't like the way the track dragged families into the fight, especially the part about Faith Evans. Ice-T understood the rules of the game because he'd been around long enough to see what happened when music spilled over into real life. What he saw in Hit 'Em Up wasn't competition, it was provocation, and in his eyes, it would only end badly. But Tupac wasn't in a position to listen. He was consumed by his rage, convinced that Biggie and his crew had set him up in the 1994 shooting, and determined to take revenge publicly. For him, Hit 'Em Up wasn't just a song, it was a statement of dominance and loyalty to death row. He wanted Ice-T to stand with him in that war, to ride with him as he went after Bad Boy. When Ice-T refused, it created a rift between them. It wasn't that Ice-T didn't love Tupac, but he couldn't support a move that he believed would destroy not only his friend, but the culture itself. By the time Tupac was murdered in Las Vegas later that year, the two men were on bad terms, and that fact has haunted Ice-T ever since. He has admitted that he's still angry with Tupac, not because of their disagreement, but because Tupac's brilliance was cut short by a path he didn't have to walk down. "He's supposed to be here," Ice-T once said, still carrying the frustration of someone who tried to warn a friend before it was too late. What makes this moment even more painful is that others around Tupac felt the same way. Shock G, who had given Tupac his first big break in Digital Underground, once went to Ice-T and asked him to talk sense into Pac because he respected him enough to maybe listen. But by then, the fire inside Tupac was too strong to be contained. He was embodying thug life in a way that went beyond performance. Where Ice-T had always treated his gangster persona as a lens for storytelling, a character he could pick up and put down, Tupac was becoming his persona entirely. That was the difference that tore them apart. For Ice-T, watching Pac's decline was like watching a train he couldn't stop. He saw the difference between an art form that was meant to reflect life and an art form that became life itself. He feared that Tupac's dedication to living every lyric would become the very thing that killed him, and tragically, That's exactly what happened. Soulja Boy is another artist that Ice-T once considered evil. By 2008, hip-hop was no longer the same culture Ice-T had helped build brick by brick in the 80s and 90s. The raw, street-centered art form he knew had now collided with the wild frontier of the internet, where viral dances and homemade music videos could launch careers overnight. And at the center of that shift stood a teenage phenomenon named DeAndre Way, better known as Soulja Boy. His song Crank That Superman had taken the world by storm, not because of lyrical mastery or deep storytelling, but because it was catchy, simple, and came with a dance that spread like wildfire across YouTube and MySpace. To fans, it was fun. To Ice-T, it felt like a cultural robbery. The spark that lit this generational fire came in the form of a mixtape by DJ Cisco called Urban Legend. Hidden inside it was a leaked audio clip that nobody was supposed to hear. Ice-T, sitting in a studio session, had been baited into commenting on the new wave of rappers. Producers threw names like Soulja Boy and Hurricane Chris at him, testing his patience. Frustrated, Ice-T unloaded. F Soulja Boy. E to D. This end single-handedly killed hip-hop. It was raw, unfiltered, and spoken as a private outburst, not a polished diss. But once it landed on the tape, it spread across the internet like wildfire, becoming the shot heard around the hip-hop world. Ice-T's anger wasn't really about Soulja Boy as a person. He admitted later that his frustration came from what Soulja represented, the idea that hip-hop was being watered down. For years, legends like Rakim, Big Daddy Kane, and Ice Cube had treated rhyming as an art that demanded skill, precision, and respect. Now, with songs like Crank That, hip-hop seemed less about lyrical competition and more about quick hits that could go viral on the internet. Ice-T wasn't ready to see the culture he fought for reduced to ringtone rap. But while Ice-T came from an era where beefs were settled with carefully crafted diss tracks and albums, Soulja Boy belonged to a new age entirely. His response didn't come from a recording booth, it came from a webcam. In true internet-born fashion, he turned on YouTube, looked directly into the camera, and gave his side. Soulja didn't deny Ice-T's legacy. In fact, he saluted him as a pioneer. But then he delivered the dagger. The game done changed? New NS out? Young NS in. He framed himself not as an enemy of hip-hop, but as the face of its evolution. And he flipped the critique back on Ice-T, asking why a veteran would tear down a teenager instead of building something positive, like opening a hip-hop school. That single YouTube video told the whole story of where hip-hop was heading. Ice-T had gone through the traditional system, mixtapes, live shows, lyrical wars. Soulja had bypassed the industry completely, using the internet to build his empire directly from his bedroom. The entire power dynamic of the culture had shifted, where once the gatekeepers decided who got a shot, the internet now puts that power in the hands of the artists themselves. The feud fizzled quickly. There were no legendary diss records, no multi-year battles. It was more of a loud debate that quickly moved on. Still, it marked a turning point. Ice-T came to regret how personal his rant sounded, admitting later that it unfairly cast him as a bitter old head desperate for beef. Soulja Boy, years later, would reflect with surprising maturity. He acknowledged Ice-T was standing on principles and morals, that he had every right to dislike a new wave of music, even if he didn't understand it. At the top of our list is Amy Mann. By 2010, hip-hop beef wasn't just about diss tracks or mixtape leaks anymore. The new war zone was social media, where words flew faster than bullets and reputations could be made or destroyed in 140 characters. Ice-T, the same man who had once warned Tupac about crossing lines with "Hit 'em Up," now found himself navigating this new digital battleground. What made it fascinating was how quickly he showed he could adapt. The moment came out of nowhere, sparked by a stray tweet from someone far outside the rap world. Grammy-winning singer, songwriter, Amy Mann. On an ordinary April afternoon, Mann fired off a casual jab that hit Ice-T like a sucker punch. Christ. There is no reason in the world anyone should ever have cast Ice-T in a television show. She wasn't talking about his music, his career in rap, or even his legacy. She was attacking his role on Law Order, SVU, a show where he had already built a reputation playing Detective Fin Tutuola. For Ice-T, who had fought tooth and nail to make the leap from gangster rap into mainstream acting, the comment wasn't just criticism, it was disrespectful. And Ice-T doesn't let disrespect slide. His response came fast and sharp, and it wasn't the kind of polite clapback celebrities sometimes post. He went straight for the jugular. "Hey at Amy Man, stop worrying about my acting, BH, and worry about your wacka music. In the meantime, eat a hot bowl of DS." It was crude, it was aggressive, and it was Ice-T in pure form, unfiltered, fearless, and absolutely intent on putting Mann in her place. But Ice didn't stop at just firing shots. he had something far more powerful at his disposal: his online army, which he proudly called the Final Level Twitter Gang, or FLTG. With one tweet, he mobilized them, and suddenly man wasn't just dealing with Ice-T. She was dealing with thousands of his loyal followers who swarmed her mentions, amplifying his anger into a full-blown digital storm. What started as a single tweet from a singer became a trending topic in hip-hop circles, turning Man into the center of unwanted attention. Realizing she had poked the wrong bear, Man backtracked almost immediately. Within hours, she issued a public apology, not a vague PR-written statement, but a direct tweet for everyone to see. He doesn't need any heckling from the peanut gallery. So, I am sorry, Mr. T, you get out there and do it. In that moment, the tables turned. Ice-T didn't drag things out or keep his foot on her neck. Instead, he did something just as calculated as his attack. He accepted her apology publicly, retweeted it for all his fans to see, and called off the dogs. Okay, homegirl apologized. Say no more. FLTG ceasefire. Then, in classic Ice-T fashion, he signed it off with swagger. Once again, there's peace in Twitterland. The whole thing unfolded in a single afternoon, but it was more than just a random spat. It showed that Ice-T, even as a veteran pushing 50 at the time, understood this new arena better than most. Twitter wasn't about dragging feuds on forever. It was about striking fast, making a spectacle, and walking away looking untouchable. By activating his followers, then publicly closing the chapter, he played the game like a general who knew exactly when to pull the trigger and when to holster his weapon. This Twitter clash with Amy Mann may not have had the weight of his fallout with Tupac or the generational divide with Soulja Boy, but it proved something just as important. Ice-T wasn't a relic clinging to the past. He was still a master of confrontation, still quick to check anyone who disrespected him, and still capable of turning conflict into a public victory.